Welcome to the TactileAudio project. Today we're going to show how to build the Teensy 4.1 controller into a touch-sensitive computer. These are the parts you're going to need. We have the Teensy 4.1 computer itself, an amazing little device, the audio shield that allows it to play SD files and create audio, some connectors, and what's called a breadboard for assembling the whole thing on, and we also have connectors that will be used to connect it to the Gemma 4.1 wires. I might add that you will either need these green ones, which are spring-loaded connectors, or the black ones, which are screw ones, but not both. I should point out that we're using these extra long pins, the male headers, for a reason. It's because we're putting them in from the bottom side of the board. Normally you'd use one of these shorter ones, you see the difference there, and you'd insert it from the top side, but we want to solder the pins to the bottom, we're eventually going to solder them to this thing and to the audio shield on the top. So we need these extra long ones, and we'll trim off the bottoms of these later after we've done soldering them. So to start with, we're going to put the male pins into the Teensy 4.1 board. We're going to solder those in. These are called breakaway pins because you break them to the correct length. They come in, I think these are 20 long, and the Teensy has more than that. So you're going to slide those through there to start with. And then you're going to take the next one, slide those in, and then you just grab it right here by the end and break that off. Simple as could be. Then you do the same thing on the other side. I'm going to put these in here. And the reason I'm putting both of these on at the same time is because I'll show you in just a second, they're going to stabilize. And I should add that sometimes when you break them, in this case it worked out pretty well, but sometimes when you break them they're rough on the ends and they won't go. If that happens, just take a file or something and file the end of it, smooth it off, and then they'll fit next to one another on the board. Okay, so we put these guys together like that. And now what we're going to do is we're going to use the perf board as just a way to stabilize it while we solder it. And that's important because, as you can see, before you solder it, it's kind of wobbly, and you don't want it so that when you solder it the pins are crooked. So this will kind of hold it straight while we work, just a convenient workbench. Okay, now it's time to start the real business of soldering. And if you're not familiar with soldering, I suggest you might want to just practice, maybe get a breadboard or something and a pin that you're going to throw away later and just try soldering a few of these. I'll show you how it's done. It's important not to apply too much heat, but it's also really important to get a good flow of the solder. So you touch the soldering iron to the pin, wait for it to heat up, and then apply a little bit of solder. And it should flow down into the hole like that. I'm going to turn it a little bit your way so that you can see that better, and do this next one. Notice that I apply the solder to the pin if I can, not to the soldering iron. And so forth down the line. It's also a good idea to start with the ends and work your way to the middle, because that sort of holds it all in place. So I'm going to do the four corners, plus don't forget that we made these headers out of two sets of pins, so okay, and so forth. Okay, so I have now soldered all of the pins on this. So step one is done, and it should look something like this. Okay, next we're going to solder the Teensy board onto the prototype board, the breadboard. And it's really important to get the Teensy board in exactly the right place on this board. So we start with the USB port on this end and the SD card reader on that end. And this little Adafruit board, you want the Adafruit facing you so you can read it. And we're not going to put it in the center, but rather it's going to go off to one side, and the reason for that is to leave us room to mount the connectors later. So you want the first pin here to go at the very end of the board, but in the F hole, right as far over as you can, like that. So if you can see that, there's one row of holes here and 4 rows of holes there. The reason we do that is that's going to give us room to mount this guy later on, which is going to go on that side. So now that we have this mounted properly, we're going to turn it over and solder it in. And this soldering is just like it was before. I suggest that you start in the corners just to stabilize things. And we'll solder this corner. And then we'll do this corner. And before you go further, just double check that it's seated down on the board like that, that it didn't like get up in the air or something. And when that's through, when you're through with that, you can just go along and solder all of these just as you did the other side. Now I might point out that for those of you who know a little bit more about engineering and electricity, you don't actually have to solder all of the pins. We're not going to use all of them. It's easier if you do, but you only have to solder the pins that are going to be connected to something. In this case, we're going to use these connectors later on, and the ones that have power and ground. But it doesn't hurt to solder all of them. It just makes for a nice solid installation. Okay, so I finished soldering on the bottom side of the breadboard now. So our Teensy is mounted very nicely on there. And the last thing we need to do on that is to trim off all the excess length of these pins. We don't need those on there, so just get your pliers. It's a good idea to put your finger over this so it doesn't go flying around the room. And cut these off one by one, and so on down the line. Try to cut them off nice and short if you can. It's a little tricky, but you can cut several at once if you want, and so forth. And we're done. We've cut off all the excess off the bottom. It's unfortunate. The only reason we have to do that is because these extra long pins only come with the long side on both sides. What we'd really like is one of these with extra long on the top but not on the bottom, but those aren't available. So we have to use these and we have to trim them off. Okay, we're ready for the next step. The next step is to attach the audio shield to our Teensy 4.1 board. This is the audio shield and it will fit right on top of here. Now there's 2 different ways of doing this. I'm going to show you the second way, but I'll illustrate the first way just in case you want to do it that way. We're going to be using these female header pins so that the 2 are removable, but you don't have to do that. It's perfectly okay if you want to just go ahead and put this on here like this and solder it on. Now if you do that, the one thing I'd warn you of is that this metal USB connector, you don't want that touching the board. There's a couple of contacts under there that if you push this all the way down against that USB connector, it could short those out. So be sure that you raise it up enough so there's a little bit of a gap there. I should also point out that this takes less room. So if you chose to solder the audio board directly on rather than using the headers, this works better because otherwise you're going to run into interference from the spring blocks, which look like this. You notice if you want to use a spring block here, it actually has to go slightly, it has to go slightly under the audio board, and if you soldered the audio board directly to the pins, there isn't room for that. So if you want to solder the audio board directly to the Teensy, you have to use these black connector blocks, screw connector blocks. But that's not how I'm going to illustrate it. We're going to do it with the header pins. These are the female header pins, and unlike the breakaway male header pins, we have to cut these, and it's a little bit of a nuisance. So what you do is you put it in there, you find out how long it needs to be, then we're going to take our pliers and put them right on the next pin over, like this, and cut it right there. And what that's going to do is leave that pin kind of hanging out. So you pull that out of there. And now we've got a little bit of extra there that we don't need. So we're going to take a file, just get rid of that plastic just for neatness. It's not necessary for the project, but I think it's nice to get rid of that excess. So we're going to file that off until it's down Okay, I filed that down now. Nice straight edge, rounded the corners a bit. I should point out, you don't have to use a file. You could use an emery board, piece of sandpaper, fine sandpaper, whatever works, but we need 2 of these, and we're ready to solder them on. All right, we're ready to solder the header pins onto the audio board, and it's convenient to use the Teensy itself as kind of a table or a workbench. What we do is we put the headers on the Teensy board like this, 1, 2. And then we put the audio board on top of that. And notice that this black connector should be at the same end as the USB. Like that. Now we've got a nice stable platform to use for soldering. And once again, let's solder the corners first. Make sure it's down nice and tight before we do the rest. So we'll solder this one. And then this one. And then just take a quick look under there. Make sure that the board is down against the header nice and tight. If it's not, at this point it's easy to just reheat the pin and push it down. Once you solder all the pins, you can't do that. And it'll look sloppy if you don't do that. And so now we just go along and solder all of the pins on. And our audio header will be ready. And there we go. Our audio shield is already mounted on the Teensy 4.1, and because we use the headers, we can take this off if we need to and put it back on, exchange audio shields between boards and so forth should we need to. You notice now the disadvantage of this is that it makes for a taller project. If we had soldered those directly on, like we mentioned earlier, without the female headers, the project would have been shorter. If that's important to you, that's a good way to go. When you get done with all of this, it's a good idea to give it a good visual inspection. Make sure all of the pins are soldered and have a good flow. For example, in inspecting this, I noticed there's a couple of pins on the bottom where I didn't get good flow. There's not quite enough, I didn't use quite enough solder, so I can go through and reflow those. Looks good. Now earlier I mentioned you have a choice between these 2 types of connectors, these spring-loaded wiring connectors and these screw ones. And I'm just going to briefly show you how, if you choose the screw ones, how you would do it. I'm not going to show the soldering process for those, but here's the positions they go in. First of all, this one is going to be the ground block, and it goes on the inner of these 2 outer lines, so just outside of the blue line here. In the last position, this is going to supply power to this one will supply power to the Gemma boards, and so it's going to go here on this next to the red line, and this one will be where our sensors go, and this is really important. It goes on the last line of a row of dots there, and it goes in pins 16, 17, 18, and 19. So be sure you get that right. And if you're going to use these, you'll need to have one of these little screwdrivers, because that's how you screw the wires into them. And also, it's really important when you do this that the open side of the connector face outward from the board. So it's a little hard to see in this video, but this side are holes, and this side are blocked with metal. You want the whole side to be facing outward so you can stick your wires in there when you get done, when you get ready to hook up the Gemmas. So that's how it would look if you're using the wiring screw blocks. Okay, the next thing we need to do is to assemble the connectors that are going to allow us to wire the Gemma-M0s. This is one of the connectors. They're these little spring-loaded things. You put a wire in the hole there. This is a knife connector that when you pull that back, you can stick the wire in, and when you let it go, it clamps onto the wire quite nicely. Now the thing is, these come and we need 4. This one has 5, and so what we need to do is disassemble this and reassemble and take one of them out. Fortunately, they're snapped together. It seems to be pretty easy to use an X-Acto knife and start at the bottom And just sort of carefully slide down the sides. You don't want to cut anything in there. So we take that out. And now we have the extra one that we need to add. And I'll put the end cap back on this one just for safe storage so we don't lose pieces or anything. And that can go back in our supply. And then we just assemble this one onto the other one as before, except it's not just the end cap but the whole switch. So we put that one on there, add the thing in as before. Make sure the tab is in there and put the end cap on. There. And so you do this for 3 blocks and you're ready to solder them onto the breadboard. Okay, so now we need to reassemble it. I'm going to show you what happens if this thing comes out because they're tricky to put back. And they fall out all the time when you're trying to take these things apart. Suppose that fell out. What we need to do is hook that back on this pin. The critical thing that's not obvious is that there's a tiny little tab right there in that slot. That has to be in the tiny little hole there, and if you get it in there, then the spring works again. So we put that back, and now there's 3 pins and 3 holes. So we have to line those up. And snap it back on. Whoops! Now you see see how it ended up there. That tab came loose while I was assembling it. So we have to take the end cap off again. The reason I'm leaving this in the video is because it happens a lot. So let's try that again. Get that back on the tab. Make sure it's seated properly, and hopefully it will stay there. Yes. So this time all the 4 springs are lined up, and we have a block of 4, which is what we need for our project. Okay, next we're going to solder the connectors onto the breadboard, and we'll start with the sensor ones. This is the one that's going to connect the Gemma's actual output to the Teensy. And this one goes right here. If the audio shield is on top, it goes right up against the audio shield there and right up against the Teensy. And you put it in, and it should just fall in there really nicely. That's why one of the reasons we were so careful to position everything correctly. And it's very important that it be there and not, say, out here like this. The reason being because there's connectors, there's pins underneath here that would be soldered to the wrong thing. We don't want those soldered there. We want them up against the Teensy here. If you've got this right, and you look right here, you should be able to see the number 14 half obscured. The number 4 is half obscured, and the number 13 is completely visible, and the number 15 is underneath the switch. That'll tell you that it's in the right spot, and it's right up against the Teensy board. Now, in order to solder this, it's best to remove the audio board because you're going to want to flip this thing over, and you want it to hold it down. So we'll do that. Flip it over while holding that. And I'm going to show a little bit of a trick here. Sometimes it's hard. You want this thing down against there, but it's not really being held down. So what we're going to do, we're going to solder a pin on. Oops, my soldering tip's a little dirty, so I'll wipe that off. I'm going to solder a pin, and then flip it over and look, and make sure that it's down tight against the board. If it's not tight against the board, at this point, it's really easy to just hold it with one finger underneath and touch that again and heat it up and get it good and tight, and then let it cool off, and then the solder will hold it. So once that's done and you're sure that it's right, then you solder the other corner, and so on all of the pins. Okay, the next one will be the one to supply power to the Gemma boards, and it's going to go at the very end of the board here. And you notice there's these 2 rows of pins underneath, and this first row needs to go on these pins, these 4 pins that are connected to power right here. So like this, it's going to span across that red line like that. And when you look under, it should be right even with the face of the board. And when you look underneath, these 4 pins should be through this second strip here, the power strip. And again, just solder that on right there as you did before. Solder the first one. Check to make sure. Now this time I don't know how well you can see that, but I didn't actually get it down against the board very well because when it was turned upside down. So I'm going to squeeze that a little bit. So I'm going to squeeze that, just touch the soldering iron there, and it snaps down. Let it cool off, and it'll hold it. There we go. And solder the rest of them. And finally, we'll do the third connector, which connects the ground to the Gemmas. Again, this is going to go on the very end of the board, and it's going to be up against the side of the board. So we put it on the end here, straddling the blue line at the very end of the board. And turn it over, solder it. It's a little tricky because the board won't sit flat, and so I'm having to press down on it just so that it'll stay flat. Again, we check, yep, it's down nice and tight, so we can solder the rest of them. And so forth. And there you have it, the Teensy microcomputer with its audio board and the connectors to connect to the Gemma-M0s. Next, we're going to look at how to assemble the Gemma-M0s. Fortunately, they're much simpler than this phase of the project.